Welcome, everyone who is joining us. I'm Ricky Bevington, president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. The council is a nonpartisan membership and grant-supported organization, and our mission is to provide a forum for informed discussion of the global affairs that impact Metro Atlanta and support the city's transformation into an international economic hub. You can find more information about becoming a member of the council at our website, wacatlanta.org. Thank you for joining today's conversation with Stanford professor Dr. Amy Zegart, discussing her new book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and Future of American Intelligence. We are so honored to have Amy here. A special welcome to some of our guests, Alan Dubose of the U.S. Department of State and diplomat in residence for the South, former Georgia State University president, Dr. Mark Becker, Adu Alper, Atlanta's honorary consul of Estonia, and World Affairs Council of Atlanta board members, Jim Reed, president of YKK America, and Joe Bancroft of the Sam Nunn School of International Studies at Georgia Tech. We have everybody in our audience today is a VIP. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy Thursday to be here with us to discuss this important topic. Dr. Amy Zegart is the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute and Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. Zegart has been featured by the National Journal as one of the 10 most influential experts in intelligence reform and is a contributing writer at The Atlantic. Author of 5 books, she specializes in U.S. intelligence, emerging technologies and national security, grand strategy, and global political risk management. And she is also a native of Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Zegart, we are so pleased. Thank you for joining us today.
Ricky, thank you so much for having me. It is such a treat to be with you today.
Let's start with the question, what is intelligence?
It's a great question. Most simply put, intelligence is information that gives policymakers decision advantage. And by that, I mean information about both threats and opportunities faster and better than adversaries.
And I think you use the term spytainment, which is the public's understanding of what intelligence is. I'm going to have you start off by reading from page 18 on your wonderful new book here. And I'll set it up for our audience. This is 2009, and you started looking for polling data about Americans' knowledge of intelligence, as well as attitudes toward hot button intelligence issues. You actually just started with your own UCLA undergraduates. This was a really difficult time. All times are difficult in the United States politically, right? But just for context, in 2009, the Iraq War, which began with faulty intelligence, was dragging into its 6th year. There was controversy raging about the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program and other things that were the context of this paragraph that I'm going to ask you to read, starting with all of these controversies.
Okay. With all of these controversies, I expected protesters outside my class and empty seats inside. But when I walked into the lecture hall the first day, I was surprised to find that it was standing room only. Students, it turned out, were hungry to learn. The class was a wide mix of freshmen and seniors, doves and hawks, privacy activists and veterans. I asked them why they were taking the course. I want to know why my buddy died in Iraq, said one. I want to know why I was there. The room went silent. This student sat in the front row, right side, every class for the next 10 weeks.
It's an important picture that I'm asking you to paint as we spend the next hour in your class, so to speak, learning about intelligence and why it's so important. We all have different reasons for being here, but we all have a real understanding that it's important to our national security. And of course, all of us as internet users, we understand it's important to our day-to-day lives. Why is it a national security problem that Americans don't understand intelligence?
Ricky, I think there are two reasons. I'm so glad you picked that particular paragraph of the book, which as you know, authors, you labor over every word. And that paragraph occupied a lot of time because it was such a moment for me. It was such a powerful experience to hear that student in particular who served in Iraq and what they wanted from intelligence. I think there are two reasons why public understanding of intelligence is so important and why I wrote this book, both for undergraduates and for a wider audience. The first is basic civics. You're talking about secret agencies operating in a democracy. And if members of the public don't know and don't care about intelligence, members of Congress won't know and won't care about intelligence. And that means we can't have the kind of democratic accountability that we have to have for these agencies. So it's really important from a civics perspective and from an accountability perspective. But the second reason is that all of us now are interacting with intelligence much more than we used to. Intelligence isn't just for people with security clearances. So think about voters needing intelligence about foreign election interference in presidential elections. Think about public service announcements that intelligence agencies are now producing for cyber threats to private sector companies. So all of us are consumers of intelligence now, and we need to understand what these agencies can do and what they can't do, what their weaknesses are, what their challenges are.
You spend some good time illustrating the TV show 24 as sort of one source of many of Americans' understanding of intelligence. Can you give us an example of how fake spies have influenced real policy?
So I found in public opinion polling that spytainment was affecting public opinion, but I also found, as you point out, that fake spies were influencing real policymakers. So two examples. One, in 2009, Leon Panetta is attending his confirmation hearings to be the CIA director. And the Senate Committee on Intelligence, members of the committee start asking him questions from the plot line of 24, fictional plot lines about ticking time bomb scenarios. We're all familiar with them from TV and the movies, right? There's a terrorist that is suspected of having vital information about an imminent attack. What do you do to elicit that information? Now, experts have said ticking time bomb scenarios are completely unrealistic. They've never happened. And yet here are members of the Senate taking a lot of time in a hearing asking the CIA nominee about a fictional plot line from TV. So that's example number one. Crazy example number two. At West Point, the dean was so concerned about cadet training being influenced by television, where torture always works, that he was so concerned about this, he flew to LA to visit the creative team from the show 24 to ask them to make episodes where torture backfires. He came wearing his uniform, and in a very strange truth is stranger than fiction moment, the crew on the set thought General Finnegan was an actor because he came in uniform.
And Amy, I'm going to encourage you to use stories like that throughout this hour because your book is filled with them. And I think that as a storyteller, they're a very effective way of conveying the larger point that you're trying to make. And I will quote from your book from Tom Clancy. It says, the difference between fiction and reality, fiction has to make sense. So we are living in a stranger than fiction world. Your book is built around three large premises that at this moment, the three things are challenging American intelligence in significant ways. Can you just bullet point those large three challenges?
So I think, and in fact, since I've written the book, I've refined how I think about those challenges. So I'm going to share what I call the 5 mores. So when we think about how emerging technology is fundamentally challenging intelligence, think about 5 things. If we think about, and by emerging technology, I mean the internet, satellites, commercial satellite imagery, like what we're seeing right now in Ukraine with troop movements we can see in the New York Times, right? That's from commercial imagery. Think about social media, artificial intelligence. And when we think about how all these technologies are converging, 5 big challenges for intelligence. Number 1, more threats through cyberspace that can attack us from the comfort of their own laptops. Number 2, more data. We're drowning in data, and intelligence officers are just like the rest of us, right? So the amount of data on Earth is doubling every 2 years. The third is more speed, right? Intelligence has to operate at the speed of relevance, and that's accelerating now. The fourth more, which we've talked about, more customers, more people outside of the government who need intelligence to secure their organizations, their private data, and the national security. And then the fifth, more competitors. So right now in the intelligence world, spying isn't just for governments anymore. Anybody with a cell phone or an internet connection can track nuclear activities of North Korea and Iran, for example. They can track military operations as they're unfolding in real time. And so from a relative perspective, our US intelligence agencies are losing their edge, right? That there's a democratization, if you will, of capability. And that means that our intelligence agencies, I think, have to radically transform themselves to continue to provide that decision advantage in this world.
Well, of course, we always want our intelligence agencies, all 18 of them in the United States, to have the competitive edge. Why are there 18 intelligence agencies in our federal government, and what do they all do?
Well, part of it is historical accretion. So I'll give you two answers to that question. The first is that I think folks that would defend the number 18 would tell you we need tailored intelligence. And each agency has a particular area of expertise. The National Security Agency, for example, focuses on intercepting signals intelligence, so email, encrypted communications, and the like. Whereas the CIA, the one that everybody knows about, focuses on human intelligence, right? Recruiting those humans on the ground to share information. So that specialization, just like any business, has its benefits. But there's a political reason why we have 18 as well, which is that typically after moments of great failure, the natural political response is to create a new agency, because big organizational reforms make it look like there's progress. But when the challenge is coordination, sometimes that can actually be counterproductive.
I'll pause for a moment and encourage our audience to please use the Q&A function to ask your question of Dr. Zegart. We can start queuing those up so that when we go to Q&A, they can be there ready for us to curate through. That's, again, the Q&A function, not the chat function. Thank you so much for, oh, that's embarrassing. I thought I put my phone on silent. The Q&A function, thank you. We look forward to answering your questions. You mentioned Ukraine, so let's actually jump to what's happening in Ukraine. Can you broadly explain to us this cyber attack that Russia is allegedly and apparently inflicting upon Ukraine?
Sure. So, Ricky, Russia's engaged in a whole variety of activities with respect to Ukraine right now. So we've seen not only reports of cyber attacks, which Russia has done against Ukraine for years. This is not a new tactic that the Russians are using. They sent the lights out in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 through a cyber attack. So they're doing that. They're obviously massing troops on the border, but they're also, and this has been publicly reported, staging what appears to be false flag operations, phony operations to try to make it look like Ukraine is committing atrocities as a pretext for invasion. And so I think one of the most interesting things about this current crisis from an intelligence perspective is the public disclosure by the United States and our allies about what they know the Russians are doing, right? So they're every day just about there's new intelligence being released. This is really unusual. And one of my colleagues called it deterrence by disclosure, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it, that letting Putin know and inoculating the public against these false narratives, these phony pretexts for invasion, is a really important and new strategy for the US government.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. How do we know that that is working?
We don't. The indicators so far that I look for is, one is, does it appear to be rattling Putin? Does he appear to be changing his strategy? And the answer in the short term appears to be yes. You can see a little bit of back and forth in the diplomacy. We won't know, I think, for some time whether this strategy has been effective, but we do know, at least from an American public standpoint, not to be surprised, right? If Putin now comes out and says it has a phony video as a pretext for invasion. So I do think from an information warfare perspective, we're already seeing dividends. Will that prevent an invasion? It may not. That doesn't mean it wasn't a successful intelligence strategy.
The public plays, you argue in your book, an important role, not only because we're now day-to-day consumers of intelligence, but actually what we post online becomes part of the intelligence data collecting, interpreting, and then leveraging. I'd like for my Zoom controllers to bring up a photo that I would like for Dr. Zegart to talk about, because this image really helps to illustrate the point that you make in your book about how sometimes intelligence agencies aren't able to necessarily figure out what's going on, but the average person in their Twitter feed maybe actually be able to announce to the world that there's a military operation. Do we have this photo available?
Yes, Laura is pulling it now.
Okay, great. Dr. Zegart, why don't you tell us what this photo is and the story that you share in your book about what is happening during this moment with a we'll say just a passerby of this situation.
So this is the iconic photo of the Bin Laden operation in 2011. And you can see President Obama and his top advisors standing at the very edge of the picture on the right, the guy in the glasses, the director of national intelligence, Jim Clapper, the guy next to him, the CIA director, John Brennan. And they're watching and listening as CIA director, Leon Panetta is going through narrating the operation. And the interesting thing here is they're trying to figure out what's going on. And meanwhile, there's a guy who's living in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a local resident, an IT consultant who is up late, and he hears strange noises outside his bedroom window, and he starts to tweet about it. And so here, the Pakistani government has no idea that our SEAL team is now in Pakistani territory, but a local IT consultant does know, and he ends up live tweeting the entire operation. So I think it's a great example of how much open source intelligence or publicly available information can reveal, even more than all the government capabilities, classified capabilities that governments may have.
And you also have an example from Russian soldiers posting selfies of themselves, which let us know what they were up to in 2014.
Yeah, it's a great example. The last Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the best intelligence about troop movements did not come from secrets, right? It didn't come from a foreign signals intercept or a document stolen from a prime minister's safe. It came from selfies. So Russian soldiers, just like other people their age, took pictures of themselves during the invasion, and they posted them on social media with Ukrainian highway signs in the background, and of course, timestamps on those photos, which enabled intelligence officials and others to really identify what they were doing, where they were doing it, and when they were doing it. And so this is just one of many examples of how much we can discern from things that are just publicly posted on the internet today.
No matter how many algorithms play a part in our intelligence gathering, and by our, I mean the United States intelligence gathering, human beings are tasked with interpreting intelligence. Talk about the concerns that you have about bias and how problematic it can be with intelligence interpretation.
So I think it's really important to underscore, by bias, I don't mean political bias. I mean cognitive bias. We all have cognitive shortcuts that we use to make sense of the world, and they can lead us astray. So we just had the Super Bowl, for example. I was rooting for the 49ers, right? Because I have optimism bias, even though they weren't in the Super Bowl. So there's research that shows, for example, that even when you pay people to be accurate, that NFL fans will always, or almost always, overpredict wins, even when they're paid, overpredict wins of their favorite team and underpredict losses. So that's just one example of what I call the 7 deadly biases. And intelligence analysts are humans, and so they have to confront these same kind of cognitive biases. And so historically, one example of optimism bias was China's surprise entry into the Korean War in 1950. We were completely blindsided by the entry of hundreds of thousands of Chinese forces that came over the border. And why were we so blindsided? Why was Douglas MacArthur and his intelligence chief caught by surprise? A large part of the explanation is optimism bias. They were so convinced that they were going to win this war and China wouldn't enter, they discounted all the intelligence pouring in that suggested China might in fact enter the war. So that's just one example of how everyday cognitive biases that we have to confront also are a problem for intelligence analysts.
There have been suggestions, and we should say the investigation into the January 6th attack on the Capitol is ongoing. It will take decades for us to truly unpack that. But I think some experts have said, and it may be optimism bias, but it may be a different type of bias, Dr. Zegart, that it was just so unthinkable that Americans would violently invade the building of the Capitol, that there was intelligence that interfaced with human bias in a way that we weren't able to prevent that. Is that your read of the situation?
Well, I think we're getting more information about January 6th every day from the Congressional Committee and other sources. So it's hard to know exactly how much bias played a role. But what's really surprised me is the public revelations of how much intelligence, I shouldn't say surprise, what I think is interesting is how much intelligence there was, how many meetings there were within the FBI across different agencies. And so there's a lot of evidence, I think, increasingly that intelligence agencies were doing some forewarning, were actually sharing information. And what happened was the Capitol Police and others didn't take sufficient action for a variety of reasons. But, there's an old saying in the intelligence business that there are always policy successes and intelligence failures. There are never intelligence successes and policy failures. I think January 6th is probably going to be known, should be known as a policy failure more than an intelligence failure.
Well, maybe that'll be the topic of your next book. I don't know. Are you working on another one?
I'm always working on another book. The next book is a project I'm doing with some colleagues about the global history of intelligence. So looking beyond the United States at other countries' intelligence agencies.
I will take a moment to invite our audience to submit questions for Dr. Zegart in the Q&A function. That's where we'll be curating your questions. We already have some populating, but please continue to put yours in there. Let's talk about the role of big tech. It's easy to blame big tech for everything, but my question for you is actually a little bit more nuanced that you're not going to have one direct answer to, but it's really about what technology companies, and they are private companies, they have proprietary information. What is their responsibility to the intelligence community, which is really the responsibility to Americans at large?
It's a really thorny challenge that you've raised, right? So tech companies, we know, have global markets. They have global shareholders. They have global employees. They are not arms of the US government. They have some interests that are aligned with national security, but they have other interests and other responsibilities. And so figuring out what the right balance is between their obligations as companies to their shareholders and their obligations as citizens to the government, that's a work in progress. And so I think what you see, at least I'm sitting here literally in Silicon Valley, and what I see here is a transformation, actually. It's a journey. If you had asked me that question several years ago, I would say the tech sector is very distrustful of the US government, only wants to cooperate when compelled for the most part, does not see itself as being particularly responsible for national security. Those days have changed. Those attitudes have changed. And I think the rise of China in particular has brought the tech sector in particular into a greater awareness. Russia's election interference in 2016, manipulating Facebook accounts and other social media accounts has been a wake-up call, I think, for all involved. So I think the tech sector does bear more responsibility. They are both a victim and a vector of harm, right? So when Google says we don't want to be involved in making weapons for the United States government, I point out that Google is a weapon for adversaries, right? Is a way for cyber attacks to affect all of us. So, but I think things are getting better and there's more interest in having those dialogues and looking more at how the tech sector and the US government can work collaboratively together.
You have mentioned China now, so we've covered both Russia and China, and your book, it really focuses on that the United States is losing its intelligence edge. Are we beating Russia and China in those respects, or are they rapidly overtaking us?
I think it depends. It's an unsatisfying answer, I know. It depends on the topic and it depends on the moment. With respect to China, I think we are losing the intelligence battle with China. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, you look at how much China has stolen in terms of intellectual property, intelligence records from the United States. The FBI director just a couple of weeks ago had a very interesting and forceful speech about China, where he noted that the Bureau is opening a counterintelligence investigation on China every 12 hours, right? That's how much China is targeting the United States. And this is after this is after a decade of stealing intellectual property. So, as senior military officials have noted, there is not a major weapon system in China that isn't based on stolen US technology, just to give you a sense of the scale. So that's sort of part one. But part two is, how well are we doing in China in terms of intelligence? And it's been publicly reported that our human intelligence capabilities were decimated over the past decade, that many of our assets were executed, others were imprisoned. And there's a real question about what led to this disaster. Some believe it was a human penetration. There's other public reporting suggesting it was a technological flaw. The system that enabled communication between the CIA and potential new assets on the ground in China was breached. And that breach enabled the Chinese to penetrate communications with other assets on the ground. So we've been losing on the ground in China over the past several years, and China's been gaining on the ground in the United States.
I love that you bring up old-fashioned spies. What is their role in modern and future intelligence?
Old-fashioned spies are never going to go out of business, because all the technical tools we have in the world can only tell us what the buildings are, not how leaders intend to use whatever's inside those buildings. So how do we know that Russian election interference in 2016 was directed by Vladimir Putin? A human source inside his inner circle, right? So humans are always going to be around. James Bond, as much as spy-themed entertainment leads us astray, James Bond is not going to go out of business.
Well, that's great to know, although it's quite scary to think that they're potentially in more danger today than they were in James Bond's era.
Well, I think technology is really complicating the human intelligence business, because think about the denied territory that we have now, with all the facial recognition, with all the sensors, with all the biometric data that can be collected on us in different points of entry. It's really hard to meet a human asset on the ground in the streets of Beijing, right? With the incredible techno surveillance that the Chinese Communist Party has created. So it's a lot harder now. It's a lot harder to have a cover. If you don't have a digital trail, you don't look like you're a real person, right? Who isn't on social media today? That in itself is an indicator of a bad cover. So it's a lot harder to do the old-fashioned spying business because of technology.
We have a wide variety of people tuning in to us today. We have small and large business owners. We have people in academia. We have students. What can the average person here today, tuning into this conversation? We're obviously here. We're arming ourselves with information. We're reading your book. What can we do in our day-to-day lives?
I think the first step you've already mentioned, which is learn about what these agencies do. And then the second step is ask what your government is doing about these agencies. One of the things I found in my research, Ricky, was that there are more powdered milk experts in Congress than intelligence experts, right? It's true. The Dairy Caucus is larger than the number of people who have ever served in an intelligence agency before. And if you think about why are there so many more people in the Dairy Caucus? Because they come from dairy states. And so voters care that they know about the dairy industry in order to be reelected. And so if you learn about intelligence and care about intelligence, ask your member of Congress what they're doing about intelligence, because it's that incentive system that needs to change for Congress to be more of a partner in making intelligence both accountable and effective.
We are almost ready for audience questions. Before we do that, we do invite you to click on the chat function right now to find out more information about becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. You get exclusive invitations to online and in-person events like this with world-class experts, Dr. Zegart. Amy, we hope to see you in person for your next book here in Atlanta. And you can contact Anna Petrova here at the council. She can answer any of your questions about joining the council as a member. So now on to audience questions. Again, please use the Q&A function here. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to start at the top from Dorothy Beasley. Please talk about the intelligence which led to the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Was there a failure?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a big debate about what went wrong in Afghanistan. I'd say it was not an intelligence failure. Now, why do I say that? The CIA, we know, and again, I have to be careful because I want to talk about what's been publicly reported. The CIA provided pessimistic assessments about how long the regime in Afghanistan would be able to sustain itself. The Biden administration, according to public reports, didn't listen to those assessments. Now, the second thing I would say is Pentagon agencies were much more optimistic about the ability of the Afghan government to survive. And I think it's a cautionary tale for us. The lesson learned is that you shouldn't grade your own homework, right? So the Pentagon intelligence agencies were more optimistic because they were grading themselves and how well the Pentagon was doing. I think it's not a coincidence that the CIA, which is independent of the Pentagon, came up with a more pessimistic assessment. But in my view, I think this was a policy error. It was an unforced error. It was a disaster. And this is something when you talk about visas for interpreters and others that have helped American forces on the ground. And we knew when the evacuation date was approaching, there's no reason why that evacuation had to unfold the way that it did. That's a policy error.
Thank you for answering Dorothy's question. Jerry Striplin asks, please speak to the role of AI in deep and actionable intelligence.
Ooh, so AI, we could talk for a long time about AI. So if you're interested in AI and intelligence and you want to get very geeky about it, I would recommend you take a look at a task force I was on by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And that task force looked explicitly at AI and intelligence. And the co-chair of that task force was our current Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. So we did a deep dive on this topic. And I'll give you the sort of top line, which is that AI is crucial for the intelligence community to adopt and harness and use. And it's crucial for a number of problems, but AI can't solve everything. And we tend to think of AI as magic fairy dust that we can sprinkle on problems and suddenly we get answers. Here's what AI is good at. It's really good at pattern recognition, right? So having data of how things looked in the past and seeing whether that data is applying today. So China's surface-to-air missile sites. If you go through thousands of images, how do we know that China is building surface-to-air missile sites or where they're located? AI is really good at figuring that out and can do it roughly 80 times faster than a human analyst can do. But what is AI not good at? AI is not good at creativity. It's not good at understanding emotion or intention or thinking about alternative hypotheses. Humans are better than machines at that. So if the intelligence community uses AI in the right way, it frees up the human analysts. So they're not looking through imagery of surface-to-air missile sites when the machines can do it. They can focus on what are Xi Jinping's intentions, right, in the future. So it's a crucial capability, but we haven't adopted it nearly fast enough or widely enough.
David Hyde asks, what do you see as being the greatest perils and opportunities of the democratization of intelligence?
So I have a whole chapter that I spent 2 years actually working on nuclear threats and this open source world. And I liken it to the Star Wars cantina, the scene in Star Wars where you've got everybody from every planet that looks like everything. This is the open source world that we're in. And so the opportunities are, you have people with a wide array of backgrounds that are dedicating time and have lots of capabilities to do things like figure out whether Kim Jong-un doctored his video of a test firing of a missile, which actually did happen. And so 3 key benefits of this emerging world: more people, right? More hands on deck to do this kind of analysis, more different backgrounds. So they bring different capabilities to bear. And third, more information that can be shared. because when things are only done in the classified world, they can get marooned in different parts of the bureaucracy. But there's the most recent example of this is the press reports of the discovery of Chinese nuclear missile silos. Hundreds of heretofore unknown Chinese nuclear missile silos discovered by independent researchers without security clearances using commercial imagery. So that's the good news. The bad news is all those same things create risks. So risk number one, errors can go viral. So there's no quality control, there's no training, there's no bureaucracy, which is enforcing sort of review of information before it gets posted online. And that can be really dangerous if information is wrong and it saps policymaker attention away from information that is correct. Second risk of this community is that you can reveal that your adversary is not doing such a good job of concealing what they're up to. And then they fix those problems, and then you've lost insight into what they're doing. So the sort of amateur detectives can reveal concealment problems that then make it harder for everybody to track adversary activities in the future. And then the last risk is crisis management. So I have in the book a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine the Cuban Missile Crisis playing out on Twitter today. And imagine that, right? We know in the 1962 real crisis, what did we need to avert nuclear war? President Kennedy needed time to think, those 13 days, and he needed secrecy to compromise with his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev. And the resolution of that crisis, missile trade, was secret for 25 years. But in this open source world now, we don't have as much secrecy. We have transparency and we have speed, not time to think. And so I worry that a huge risk in this emerging open source world is that countries are no longer in control of managing crises. Third parties can fact check on Twitter, and that makes crises harder to manage.
You're right. We could spend hours talking about that. My goodness.
Sorry, it's the perils of having a professor talk about something she's interested in.
We'll have to sign up for your classes. Quanta Don Light asks, do these phony war games affect the stock market's defense and energy sectors? If so, how?
It's a great question, and I don't think I know the answer to it. I mean, I think we're seeing lots of market volatility right now related to Ukraine. It's hard to know how much of that is about what's going on with Putin. I think that's the gist of the question, and the sort of false flag operations, and how much of this is just general anxiety about a whole host of things, including with defense stocks, the continuing resolutions in Congress, right? I think that's driving a lot of this. You can't have good defense spending if you don't know what your defense budget is, and you can't start new programs under a continuing resolution. So if you're a defense company that's doing innovative new programs, you're really being hit hard by this delay in the budget process because you can't start anything new. So it could be that too.
Thank you. Charles Shapiro asks, can you talk about organizations like Bellingcat, where private citizens crowdsource really cutting edge intel? And if you could answer that, but also for those who aren't familiar with Bellingcat, just give us an overview of what that is.
Bellingcat is such an interesting organization. So it started off with a guy in the UK who just became interested in how journalists were posting a lot more on Twitter than they were in their official reports. And so what it is now is a sort of crowdsourced organization of mostly volunteers around the world that are using open source intelligence to expose global injustices. So this organization is probably best known for figuring out that the Russians were behind the shootdown of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine. Bellingcat did incredible detective work, piecing together everything from dash cam footage on cars. Apparently this is a hobby in Ukraine, to take pictures from your dash cam of where you're going. That camera footage posted online revealed the movement of the missile transporter through Ukraine from Russia and where it went. I mean, it's an incredible forensic story of what they did there. And Bellingcat's done a number of other things too, related not just to Russia, but Syrian atrocities and other things. So it's a fascinating organization. And it's, as I mentioned, almost all volunteers. The thing that's really interesting about Bellingcat to me is their quality control is generally very high. That's not true for a lot of open source intelligence, analysts and collectors. And so I think Bellingcat really is at the vanguard of this new open source intelligence ecosystem.
But there still have to be human interpreters who are still gatekeepers. It's open source, and yet there are ethical gatekeepers.
There are, and I think one of the things, I talked to a lot of folks in the imagery analysis business for this book. And one of the things that they pointed out was, there's a misconception that anyone can look at pictures. You have satellite images, for example, and anyone can figure out what they are. And that is not at all the case. That pictures are often very deceptive, especially when taken from space, because you're looking directly overhead. So if you imagine the St. Louis Arch and you were standing on top of the arch, you wouldn't be able to identify it as the St. Louis Arch, right? What we think of is the shadow of the arch or looking at it from the ground. It's a completely different interpretation depending on whether you're looking from overhead or on the ground. And so there's a risk that we think these things are easier to analyze than they are.
Mark Zashin asks, you mentioned biases. How about forecasting?
So forecasting is inevitably piercing the fog of the future. And so I think these biases can affect how we think about and how we communicate forecasting of the future. So one of the examples I give, and I do with my students, is about framing biases. So I ask them, imagine that I've created this beauty pill. I actually taught this with Condi Rice in our business school class. Imagine Dr. Rice and I have come up with this pill that we say is 99.9% safe. And if you take this pill, you're going to look the best you've ever looked for the rest of your life. How many of you would take the beauty pill? And invariably, all the hands go up, or all but a couple. And then I say, well, now what if we told you that if you take this pill, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that you will drop dead right here, right now? How many of you would take the pill now? Now the hands go down. But statistically speaking, 99.9% safe and 1 in 1,000 chance of dying are exactly the same. So how we present data affects how people interpret it too. That simple change in how we present it can make the difference between whether you raise your hand and say, yes, I'm going to do it, or there's no way I would do that.
Greg Colleen asks, when Trump and Putin held a joint press conference in 2018 in Helsinki, Trump sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies. How damaging was that?
It was very damaging. And it was part of a series of damaging moves that President Trump unfortunately made towards his intelligence community. He released classified intelligence in a seemingly cavalier fashion that burned one of our allies that had provided the intelligence. He also accused the intelligence community of really politicizing intelligence, spying on his campaign without any evidence that was in fact the case. And I think we're in repair mode now in the intelligence community. Intelligence doesn't work well if presidents believe that it's partisan, that it's not professional. They're not always right. They make mistakes, they make catastrophic errors, but presidents have to trust that they're getting the best intelligence that they can. And when President Trump treated intelligence as sort of a marketing function of the US government, that really eroded, I think, public perceptions of intelligence, and it eroded morale inside the intelligence community.
Thank you. Jim Reed asks, Dr. Zegart, do you think there are any aggregators of data intelligence that the ordinary person can look to sift through all the Twitter feeds and posts to provide useful intelligence for us to better understand the world? He says, news outlets do not appear to be useful. So are there other sources that we as citizens can rely on?
Well, that's, I knew he would ask a really good question. Yes, there are. I mean, there are companies that are called social listening companies that if you're interested in understanding social media trends and what they indicate before they sort of are obviously viral, there are companies that do that. There are increasingly news aggregators too. So if you want to focus on your particular area, if you're a company CEO and you're interested in political risk, for example, there are specialty aggregators and specialty consulting companies that do that as well. For everyday Americans, I worry that we're in a world of abundance, too much information from too many sources about too many things. And that's just a hard problem to solve.
Thank you. Okay, Tom Welch asks, there's some repetition, so I'm going to skip to Tom Welch, who asks, you pointed out that tech companies are not arms of the US government, but should we be concerned about their relationships with other countries' intelligence services? For example, I understand that Zoom fired some of its employees for sharing information on global users with Chinese law enforcement without company authorization. I don't know if that is to be true, but that's part of this question.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, but I think it's a really important point, which is how do we think about what American companies are doing with foreign governments beyond just following foreign laws? Is it wise to go into China, for example, if there is a Chinese law that compels you to share your data with the Chinese government, for example? And so this is, again, very challenging territory for our companies. Obviously, I'm a national security person. I think that tech companies have a responsibility to the US government that is different than their responsibility to other governments around the world. But I understand that that's a challenging path to walk. But I think we're at the end of naivete. If you're in a global company, you cannot be agnostic about what you're doing. And the example I pick on a lot is Google, which at the same time, Google said they didn't want to continue their work with Project Maven, which was an AI program with the Pentagon. They were working on a project called Project Dragonfly to make a better censored search engine, presumably for use by China. That era where it doesn't matter who our customer is, we're just serving our customer, that era is over. And I think Google executives now recognize that.
For our small and medium-sized business owners who are on this conversation today tuning in, would you advise that company owners have policies regarding this, even if they're a small company?
I think any company that has markets or business or supply chains outside of the United States needs to think about political risk. And political risk comes in many forms. It could be supply chain disruptions. It could be foreign new regulations that could affect your business. And so I think, what we see from the Cold War was an easier time where business and politics were more separate, except for a handful of industries like the oil industry or extractive industries. In this geopolitical environment, politics and business are much more linked. We think about the economic and political competition with China. And so you can't avoid political risk, no matter what kind of business you're in, unless you're entirely operating within the United States. And so it's important to think about, if you're a meat industry or your Home Depot or your Target with cyber threats, you have to think about the risks emanating from places outside of the United States as a matter of business.
Thank you. Luciana Vieira asks, I once read a book called Spy Schools and was alarmed about the tactic of many agencies, American as well as foreign, to recruit youngsters still in college. How realistic is this tactic? Are college students really getting recruited this way?
Well, my college students would tell me that they're not youngsters, but I agree. I think of them as young. I'm certainly, the older I get, the younger they look. So, intelligence agencies recruit on college campuses. US agencies do. And by the way, foreign intelligence agencies are operating on university campuses as well. So let's not kid ourselves about that. So this is a time where there's a lot going on university campuses. Intelligence agency recruitment, in my experience, has been very open. So when the CIA comes to campus, they're the CIA. They say they're the CIA. They talk to you as openly as they can about what it is that they're doing. So it's not a cloak and dagger recruitment like you might think of from the movies. It's a lot more bureaucratic and mundane than that.
I was never recruited to become a spy when I was in college, I'm glad to say. A lot of credit card offers though, but no spying.
Not yet. It's not too late.
Not too late, except my pictures everywhere. We have another question from Mark Zash, and I'm trying not to do duplicates, but this is a new topic. Should the intelligence agency be wary of cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, crypto is an area where there's a lot of concern. And part of the challenge with cryptocurrency is it's a favorite money-making tool of bad guys. Whether you're a drug dealer or ransomware, or you're the government of North Korea, crypto is for you because you can hide. And so I think one of the challenges now is when we have central bank cryptocurrencies. What does that mean? So the concern I'm hearing from folks in the government is it could erode the ability of our sanctions to have teeth. So if you can imagine a number of countries that have their own cryptocurrency, and now suddenly global financial institutions don't rely on the United States to process payments, right? The dollar doesn't have the kind of currency, if you will, that it did. That means countries can evade the power of US sanctions or multilateral sanctions. And that renders that crucial tool much weaker than it otherwise would be. So I'm most worried from a geopolitical perspective about the lessening power of our sanctions in the future as a result of cryptocurrency.
Fascinating, because we're hearing so much about sanctions right now vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. Iris Schultz asks, how much collaboration exists between countries that share intelligence, and how does that influence US policies?
There's a lot of intelligence sharing. And in particular, there's a particularly close relationship between what's affectionately referred to as the Five Eyes, 5 countries. It's the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Those 5 countries have been sharing and have a close working relationship for a very long time, and that's continuing. But beyond that, they're more frenemy relationships. So there's sharing, but there's also competition. Allies spy on each other. Israel is active at espionage in the United States. France is active at spying, and allies know this. This is how the world works. And so allies do spy on each other with rare exception. I would put the Five Eyes as the rare exception.
We're all frenemies.
It's a technical term in my book.
Jan Slimming asks, please, can you advise the best route for a student to enter the world of intelligence? Must you be in the military, or can civilians apply?
Civilians can absolutely apply. So of the 18 different agencies we talked about, many of them are military, but even military agencies have civilians in intelligence roles. I would encourage, and as I say to my own students, there's no one major or no one path to get into the intelligence business. That what intelligence agencies are looking for on the analysis side is people with good thinking skills, right? And people with areas of expertise, whether it's technology or whether it's regional and linguistic capabilities. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to think about pursuing an intelligence career.
Well, we here, the council, of course, is based at Georgia State University, so we're always eager to help young people in Atlanta and anywhere explore new career opportunities. So I might end on that note. Dr. Zegart, how did you choose this career that you're in academia, but specializing in intelligence?
Totally by accident. It is probably the poster child for the random walk and how you end up doing things you didn't anticipate. So I started off in Kentucky taking Chinese after school for fun, just because I saw Deng Xiaoping on TV and was captivated when he came and visited the United States. And that led me on a path to studying Chinese and studying Chinese politics. And then I sort of stumbled my way into the US side of foreign policy. And a lot of fortunate circumstances ended up leading me into getting my PhD. Honestly, I thought it would be like college, only longer, and it would be really fun. And I was wrong about the really fun part. It was really hard, but it's been a really wonderful career to be able to think about the challenges that face the country.
And you continue to publish books that hopefully Americans are reading, but also hopefully our members of Congress are reading, because they are really ultimately tasked with with wrangling and creating policies to help us regain our intelligence edge. Are you optimistic about the future, Dr. Zegart?
You know, Ricky, I really am. And what makes me, I catastrophize for a living, but I'm actually an optimist at heart. And I think what makes me really optimistic is teaching college students. So this book started in a college class. I'm going to teach a class at Stanford in a few weeks based on the book. And when you see young people, whether it's at Georgia State or Stanford, and you see how passionate they are about what they do, how smart they are, how committed they are, you can't help but be optimistic about the future.
And Dr. Amy Zegart's book is called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. It's out now. You can find a link to buy it at our website, wacatlanta.org. Dr. Amy Zegart, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And for our audience who are still with us, please mark your calendars for some upcoming events. On Tuesday, February 22nd, our Members Forum hosts MailChimp's Director for International Growth, discussing how a small Atlanta startup grew into an international powerhouse. On Thursday, February 24th, we're hosting our President's Breakfast exclusively for Chairman Circle Prefer and corporate members. Please reach out to us if you'd like more information about attending. And Friday, March 4th, we're having an in-person event. We would love to see all of you. This is with Estonia's ambassador to the US. This is a breakfast event in Midtown. Sign up for our newsletter for more details. Thank you to today's behind the scenes team, our graduate students, Anna Petrova of the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies, and Laura Brower from the Robinson College of Business, and our interns, stellar interns Kanko Zonu from the Georgia State University and Murphy Reef from the University of Georgia. Again, our website is wacatlanta.org. We are the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and we're so grateful to have Dr. Zegart joining us today. Thank you so much.